All right, I want you to picture something. The year is 1932. We're in Savannah, Georgia. It's hot, I'm sure. The Depression is really starting to bite down. But in one specific backyard, something, well, something truly odd is happening.
Yeah, something you wouldn't expect.
There's this 6-year-old girl, and she is laser-focused on training a chicken.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about teaching it to, tech on command or something normal like that.
No, not at all. She is teaching this chicken how to walk backward.
It's such a bizarre, incredible image. And the thing is, this wasn't just some private childhood quirk. It actually got noticed.
It did.
Pathé News, the old newsreel company, they actually sent a film crew to her house. They filmed a little segment called Little Mary O'Connor with her and this bantam chicken literally walking in reverse across the yard.
It's just amazing. And decades later, when this little girl was a full-grown woman and, one of the most important and challenging American writers of her century, she looked back at that moment.
With that classic wit of hers.
Exactly. She said, "I was just there to assist the chicken, but it was the high point in my life. Everything since has been an anticlimax."
And that quote, that's it. That's the perfect key to unlock everything we're going to get into today in this deep dive on Mary Flannery O'Connor.
It says so much.
It really does. You get her humor, which was always incredibly dry and dark, but you also get her fascination with the strange, the thing that goes against the grain. That backward-walking chicken is the perfect metaphor for her entire career. She was someone who looked at the world, well, in reverse.
She came at reality from a completely different angle.
A completely different angle, and she found the surreal, the grotesque, right smack in the middle of everyday life.
So that's what today's all about. We're going to try and understand that angle. We're unpacking the life, the mind, the work of Flannery O'Connor. Born in 1925, and she died, tragically, in 1964. And our mission, really, is to figure out how a devoutly Catholic woman living a pretty quiet, secluded life on a farm with her mother in the very Protestant rural South. How did she become the creator of some of the most savage, violent, and frankly, hilarious fiction of the 20th century?
It's a huge paradox, right? That's what keeps people coming back to her, I think, even 60 years after her death. She's constantly writing about things like morality and divine grace, but her stories are just full of serial killers, con men, philosophical nihilists, and what she famously called grotesque characters.
And then there's the personal paradox. She lived in physical seclusion because of this awful illness, but her voice on the page is so world-weary, so tough, so sardonic.
It really is. And we've got a lot of great sources to help us dig into this. We're looking at her biography, of course, but also her private letters. That collection, The Habit of Being, is incredible.
We'll also get into some very recent discoveries, which I find fascinating, about her visual art.
Yeah.
And even the fact that her unfinished novel was just published in 2024.
Yeah, and we should be clear, this isn't just going to be a book report. We're not just listing titles. We really want to get into the weeds. We need to unpack what she meant by a term like Christian realism, which is a phrase that I think can really confuse a modern reader.
Absolutely.
We're going to have to look, head on at the controversy around her private letters about race, which is complicated and, frankly, it's uncomfortable. And we want to explore why she believes so strongly that grace can change us, but in her words, the change is painful.
The change is painful. That's a line that really sticks with you. So let's start at the beginning, see where that worldview came from. We met her as a 6-year-old with a chicken in Savannah. Let's flesh that out a bit. She was born Mary Flannery O'Connor in 1925, an only child.
Right. Her parents were Edward and Regina.
Yeah.
And they were of Irish Catholic descent, which is important. In the South at that time, being Catholic automatically made you a bit of an outsider in the largely Protestant culture.
Bit of a displaced person from the start.
In a way, yeah. Her father was a real estate agent. But if you read her own descriptions of herself as a child, you don't get the sense of a typical Southern belle in the making.
Yeah.
She later called herself a pigeon-toed child with a receding chin and a "you leave me alone or I'll bite you" complex.
I love that, the "I'll bite you" complex. It feels like that never really left her. It just became more verbal.
It absolutely evolved into her literary voice. She just wasn't interested in pleasing people, ever. But there's a really dark shadow over that childhood that we just can't skip past. In 1937, her father was diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus.
Lupus?
Yeah, it's a brutal autoimmune disease. Your body's own immune system basically starts attacking its own tissues. And back then, in the late 30s, the treatments were Well, they were almost non-existent. He died in 1941.
And Flannery was only 15.
Just 15. It's a foundational trauma. And as we're going to see, that specific disease, lupus, it wasn't just a tragedy that happened to her father. It was a kind of genetic ghost that was going to come back and completely define her own life.
So after he died, she and her mother, Regina, they stayed in Milledgeville, Georgia.
That's right. They lived in her mother's family home in town, which was known as the Klein Mansion. And then a bit later, in 1951, they moved out to the country to a farm called Andalusia.
And Andalusia is the place most people picture when they think of her.
It is, but before we get to the farm life and the peacocks and all of that, we have to look at how she formed herself as an artist. And this is where things get really interesting, because she didn't just start out as a writer. She was a visual thinker, first and foremost.
This is one of those details that kind of gets glossed over in the standard high school English class version of her life. We think of writers as people who just live in words, but she was a cartoonist, a really prolific one.
She was. When she was in college at the Georgia State College for Women, she was the art editor for the student newspaper, and she made all these fantastic linoleum block cartoons.
Lino cuts. For anyone who's done that, you know it's a subtractive medium. You have to carve the image out of the block. It really forces a certain kind of style.
It absolutely does. You can't really do subtle shading or soft edges. It demands strong, bold, high contrast lines, big blocks of black and white. And many critics point to this idiosyncratic style of her cartoons and say it directly shaped her fiction.
How so?
She saw the world as a caricature, in a way. She would find the most distinctive, the most grotesque feature of a person and exaggerate it to reveal a deeper truth about them. She even said once, "I don't know how to write, but I can draw."
So when you read her descriptions in her stories, and she describes a character with a face like a cabbage or a Bible salesman with hollow leg.
That's the cartoonist.
Sketching with words.
Exactly. It's the art of using exaggeration not to lie, but to get at a truth that's maybe hidden under the surface. If you draw a politician with a gigantic smiling mouth, you're saying something true about them. She did the same thing, but with a person's moral flaws. She'd amplify their pride or their hypocrisy to make it visible to the reader.
So she graduates in 1945, and she heads north.
She does. She gets into the Iowa Writers' Workshop.
Which even then was becoming a legendary place.
Oh, yeah. It was the center of the literary universe in post-war America. She actually enrolled to study journalism at first, but she switched to fiction very quickly. And the people she's interacting with there, I mean, it's a who's who. Robert Penn Warren, John Crow Ransom, Paul Engle.
And Paul Engle, he read her early stuff.
He was the first person to read the drafts of what would eventually become her first novel, Wise Blood.
Yeah.
He saw her talent right away, even though her style was so different, so strange, compared to the polished realism that was popular then.
And Iowa is also where she makes a really key decision about her identity. She rebrands herself.
She does. She drops her first name, Mary. She apparently thought Mary O'Connor sounded too common. Her exact words were that it sounded like an Irish washwoman.
Whoa.
Yeah. She wanted something that would stand out on the cover of a book, something memorable, so she becomes simply Flannery O'Connor.
It's a great name. It's strong. It's a little ambiguous. It sounds serious.
It worked. It sounds almost severe, which fits her perfectly. So she gets her MFA. She spends some time at Yaddo, the artists' colony up in New York, and then she ends up living with Robert and Sally Fitzgerald in Connecticut.
And the Fitzgeralds are hugely important to her story.
They are crucial. Robert Fitzgerald was this brilliant poet and translator of the Greek classics. If you've ever read the Odyssey or the Iliad in English, chances are it was his translation. They became her closest friends, her editors, and her intellectual sparring partners. They really understood the deep Catholic theology that was fueling her work.
But even while she's up north, surrounded by these East Coast intellectuals, the style she's developing is just so deeply, unmistakably Southern.
Oh, completely. Which brings us to that label that always gets attached to her, Southern Gothic.
Right. And people throw that term around a lot. It can mean anything from, spooky stories with Spanish moss to just anything weird that happens south of the Mason-Dixon line. What did it mean for O'Connor?
Well, she had a really specific, almost combative relationship with that term. She knew exactly how people outside the South, especially in the North, saw her and her work. She had this fantastic quote about what she called the Northern reader.
I have it right here. It's brilliant. She said, "Anything that comes out of the South is going to be called grotesque by the Northern reader unless it is grotesque, in which case it is going to be called realistic."
It's just such a perfect cutting observation on regional bias. She's basically saying, you guys up north already think we're a bunch of freaks, so when I write about the freaks, you think I'm just reporting the news.
But she did embrace that label, the grotesque.
She took it and she ran with it, but for a very specific purpose. Her characters are, they're morally flawed in the extreme. They're often physically disabled or disfigured, which reflects her own later experience. They're often these wild-eyed fundamentalist Protestants. And the one thing that unites almost all of them is a complete and total lack of sentimentality.
That word, sentimentality, it feels like it was her ultimate enemy. She seemed to have an almost physical revulsion to it.
She despised it. She actually once compared sentimentality to pornography.
That's a pretty strong comparison. How do you get from, say, a schmaltzy movie to pornography?
For her, the logic was that both of them demand an immediate emotional payoff without any of the hard work or the reality that's required to earn it. Sentimentality wants that warm, fuzzy feeling of connection or grace, but it skips over all the suffering and messiness of real life.
And pornography.
Pornography wants the feeling of sexual release, but it skips the messiness and commitment of actual intimacy. For her, both were cheap. Both were lies. They were shortcuts that avoided the difficult, grotesque truth of the human condition.
So when the first reviewers of her work called it brutal or sarcastic or horror, they were missing the point entirely.
From her perspective, yes. They were missing the theology behind it. She always defended her work by calling it Christian realism, and I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms to a lot of people today.
Right. When you hear Christian fiction now, you tend to think of something very safe, very clean. A wholesome romance where everyone finds faith and lives happily ever after.
And that is the exact opposite of what she was doing. She was fighting against that safe, clean version of faith. She believed a writer's meaning had to be embedded in the story, in the action, not spelled out like a sermon. She saw the world as fallen, she saw human beings as deeply, deeply flawed, and she believed that grace, God's grace, was not some warm blanket.
It was a disruption.
It was a disruption, it was a terror, it was a violent force that knocks you off your feet.
Which brings us back to that quote, grace changes us and the change is painful.
Precisely. That's the engine of all her stories. Violence in an O'Connor story is almost never gratuitous. It's a tool of grace. It's often the only thing powerful enough to wake a character up from what she called their moral blindness.
These are characters who are just so stuck.
So stuck in their own pride, their own little social hierarchies, their own intellectual arrogance, that they need a profound shock to the system. They need a car crash, or to be attacked by a bull, or to meet a murderer on a dirt road.
Something to shatter the ego.
Exactly. Something to shatter that hard shell of self-satisfaction so they can finally see reality, see themselves for the first time.
So let's take her most famous story. A Good Man is Hard to Find.
Yeah.
You have the grandmother, who is just this wonderfully annoying, manipulative, self-righteous character.
Oh, she's a masterpiece of annoying characters.
And she and her family run into this escaped convict, the misfit. That final scene, that moment of pure terror for her. In O'Connor's world, that's actually her moment of salvation.
100%. The misfit is literally holding a gun on her. Her whole world has collapsed. All her little social pretensions are useless. And in that last second, all the nonsense burns away. She looks at this killer and she has a moment of genuine human connection. She reaches out to him and says, "Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children."
It's an incredible moment of empathy.
It's a moment of grace. She sees him not as a monster, but as another broken human being, just like her. And then he shoots her 3 times in the chest.
It's so brutal. And the misfit's line afterwards is just chilling. She would have been a good woman, he says, if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life.
It is brutal. But O'Connor would say that it's far better to die in a single moment of truth than to live 100 years in a comfortable lie. The violence served its purpose. It shocked her into grace. And this all connects to this very famous story about her own faith, the one people call the Eucharist incident.
Right, the literary dinner party story.
It's a classic. She was at a dinner party in New York with a group of intellectuals, including the writer Mary McCarthy.
And Mary McCarthy was a very prominent, very secular intellectual, a lapsed Catholic.
Exactly. And somehow the conversation turns to the Eucharist, the Catholic sacrament, where the bread and wine are believed to literally become the body and blood of Christ. And McCarthy, trying to be sort of diplomatic and polite, says that she thinks of the Eucharist as a symbol, and a pretty good one at that.
And Flannery, who had probably been sitting there quietly the whole time.
She just lowers the boom. She leans forward and says flatly, "Well, if it's a symbol, to hell with it.
If this is symbol, to hell with it.
That one line just explains her entire body of work. For O'Connor, things weren't symbols. They were. The spiritual wasn't an abstraction floating above the real world. It was embedded in the real world. The world was, in her words, charged with God. If the Eucharist is just a symbol, it's powerless. If her stories are just metaphors for something else, they're powerless. She wanted the blood and the dirt and the grace to be real physical things. She had no time for abstractions.
That intensity is just blazing through her work. I mean, her output wasn't huge, but it was so dense. She wrote 2 novels, Wise Blood in 1952, and then The Violent Bear It Away in 1960, and then the short story collections.
Right. A Good Man is Hard to Find was published in 1955, and Everything That Rises Must Converge came out just after she died in 1965. Later, they were all collected into the Complete Stories.
And that collection won the National Book Award in 1972, posthumously.
And not only did it win, but in a 2009 poll of writers and critics, it was voted the best book ever to have won the award. Think about that. That's putting her ahead of Faulkner, Philip Roth, Saul Bellow. It shows you the lasting power of those stories.
They don't feel dated.
They don't, because they're about things that don't date. Human pride, mortality, the capacity for both cruelty and grace. And when you really look at the themes, you see she wasn't just writing about strange people in the backwoods. She was tackling the biggest social issues of her day.
Take a story like The Displaced Person. That's really about the Holocaust and the refugee crisis after World War II.
It is. It's about a Polish refugee, a survivor of the camps who comes to work on a southern farm. And the story is a brilliant dissection of how the locals, the farmhands, and the owner react to him. They can't comprehend the scale of the evil he's experienced. They're too wrapped up in their own petty bigotries and social hierarchies to see the monumental human tragedy standing right in front of them.
And then a story like the title story from her second collection, Everything That Rises Must Converge.
Yeah.
That is directly about racial integration in the South.
Directly. It's this devastating portrait of a generational conflict. You have an older woman, the mother, who is just completely stuck in the racist mindset of the Old South. And you have her son, Julian, who sees himself as this enlightened, progressive liberal.
But O'Connor doesn't let him off the hook.
Not at all. In fact, she portrays Julian as being just as flawed as his mother, if not more so, because his progressivism is all about his own ego. It's intellectual and abstract. He wants to teach his mother a lesson, but there's no love or compassion in it. He's using his supposed enlightenment as a weapon against her.
That seems to be a recurring target for her. The well-meaning liberal who thinks they have all the answers.
Oh, she loved to skewer that character. The sociologist, the do-gooder, the intellectual who comes down to the rural South with a theory about how to fix people. In her stories, they fail again and again because they're operating on what she saw as a sentimental illusion. The idea that human beings are basically good and just need to be educated.
Whereas O'Connor's starting point was very different.
Her starting point was the doctrine of original sin. She believed people are fundamentally broken and in desperate need of salvation, not just education. And you can't have a conversation about her work without talking about her own body, because her physical reality took a dramatic turn in 1952.
Right when her career was taking off.
Exactly. She was only 27. She'd just published Wise Blood. She was getting noticed. And then she was diagnosed with disseminated lupus erythematosus, the very same disease that had killed her father.
And in 1952, that diagnosis was basically a death sentence.
It was. The doctors told her she had maybe 5 years to live. She ended up surviving for 12, which was a miracle in itself, but it meant her life of independence was over. She had to move back home, a forced return to her mother's farm, Andalusia.
That had to be incredibly difficult. You know, she tasted that freedom in Iowa and New York. She was corresponding with the literary elite, and suddenly she's back in her childhood home, completely dependent on her mother for her daily care.
It was a massive, massive constraint. But in a way that is so typical of her, she turned that prison into her workspace. She established this incredibly rigid routine. She'd go to Mass in the morning, then she would write for 3 hours, 9 to noon, every single day, no exceptions, and then she'd spend the entire afternoon and evening just recuperating, reading, and dealing with her illness.
And the treatment for lupus back then was brutal in itself.
It was. The main treatment was cortisone, these early high-dose steroids. And the side effects were just awful. They caused her face to swell up, which is why she looks so different in later photographs. Her hair thinned, and worst of all, they weakened her bones. Her hip bones eventually just disintegrated, and she spent the last decade of her life on crutches.
So she was living with constant pain.
Constant pain. And yet, look at what she produced in that state. She wrote the bulk of her work, over 24 short stories and her second novel, while on these debilitating drugs. It completely changes how you read her descriptions of the human body in her stories.
When she writes about bodies that are failing or grotesque or that don't do what the mind wants them to do.
She's not just making it up, she's writing from direct personal experience. When your own body is literally attacking itself, the idea of the grotesque isn't some abstract literary device. It's your mourning reality.
And somehow, in the middle of all this pain and all this writing, there were the birds. We started with the backward walking chicken, but at Andalusia, her obsession with birds just exploded.
It became her trademark. She started raising peafowl, peacocks and peahens. At one point, she had around 100 of them roaming the farm.
100 peacocks. I can't even imagine the noise.
They are not quiet birds. They have this scream that famously sounds like a woman being murdered, but she loved them. And she had other birds, too. Ducks, geese, even ostriches and emus for a time. But the peacocks were special.
She wrote a whole essay about them, the king of the birds.
She did. And for her, the peacock was this perfect living symbol of what she was trying to write about. It represented divine beauty and mystery.
It makes sense when you think about it. I mean, a peacock is kind of a clumsy, awkward-looking bird with those weird feet and that scrawny neck. It's a bit grotesque, really.
All right, until it opens its tail.
And then it's just this overwhelming, unbelievable, iridescent explosion of beauty.
Exactly. It's grace made visible. It's beautiful, but it's also strange. And she loved the eyes on the feathers. She connected them to the all-seeing eyes of the church. It was a constant living reminder of her core themes.
And it wasn't a lead-in-life hobby either. There's that great anecdote from her high school years.
Oh, the duck. It's fantastic. Before the peacocks, when she was a teenager, she had a pet duck. And she sewed a complete outfit for it.
Like a little jacket.
A full outfit. Underwear and clothes. She sewed a whole wardrobe for this duck and then took it to school to model it for her home economics class.
That's just wonderful. It shows that even then, she had this instinct for the surreal, for performance.
It does. And it's a good reminder that she wasn't just this grim, suffering saint. She had this playful, strange sense of humor. But we absolutely should not mistake her physical isolation on the farm for intellectual isolation.
No, she was anything but a hermit in that sense.
She was a voracious reader. And she was a professional critic. She wrote over 100 book reviews for various Catholic newspapers and diocesan bulletins.
And she wasn't reviewing, light inspirational fiction.
No way. She was reviewing serious, difficult theologians and philosophers, people like Simone Weil, Romano Guardini, the Christian existentialist Gabriel Marcel. She was deeply, deeply engaged with the most complex theological and philosophical currents of her time.
And she didn't just stay on the farm.
Not at all. Despite being on crutches, despite her frail health, she traveled all over the country to give lectures. She made over 60 public appearances at colleges and writing conferences. She was determined to be a part of the literary conversation.
Which brings us to a part of the conversation about her that is much more difficult. It's something we have to talk about if we're going to be honest about her legacy. We have to talk about the Mrs. Turpin letters and the controversy over her views on race.
Yeah, this is, it's a critical part of understanding O'Connor in the 21st century. For a long time, the public image of her was that for a white woman in Georgia in the 1950s and 60s, she was relatively progressive.
Right. The record shows she voted for John F. Kennedy in 1960. She privately expressed support for Martin Luther King Jr. and the goals of the civil rights movement. And her stories, as we've said, often brutally satirize racists.
But then you read her private letters, and a very different and much more troubling picture emerges.
A much more complicated one.
Yes. She had this long correspondence with the playwright Mariette Lee. And in those letters, O'Connor sometimes adopted the persona of Mrs. Turpin, a character from her story Revelation who is this incredibly prejudiced, self-satisfied, judgmental woman.
And the things she wrote as Mrs. Turpin, or just as herself, they can be really jarring to read today.
They can. There's one quote in particular that is cited all the time. She wrote to Mariette Lee, I'm an integrationist by principle and a segregationist by taste. I don't like Negroes. They all give me a pain, and the more of them I see, the less and less I like them, particularly the new kind.
Integrationist by principle and a segregationist by taste. That phrase just captures such a deep, uncomfortable conflict. It's like she's admitting that her intellect, her moral compass, knows that integration is right, but her gut reaction, her cultural conditioning, is pulling her in the opposite racist direction.
Exactly, and she doesn't try to pretty it up. She just states it with that same blunt, unsparing honesty she applies to everything else. And it creates this massive paradox for us as readers. Her biographer, Brad Gooch, he points out that in other letters, she's fiercely defending a black friend she made back in Iowa to her own mother, who was more traditionally racist.
So in one context, she's defending a cross-racial friendship, and in another, she's writing these frankly ugly racist comments.
Which is why Gooch says, it's complicated. I don't think that we can box her in. She resists easy categorization. But that complexity has had real-world consequences. In 2020, Loyola University in Maryland made the decision to rename a residence hall that had been named for her.
They cited the racism present in some of her work, and specifically these private letters.
It forces us into that really difficult debate about separating the art from the artist, especially when the artist's work is so focused on dissecting the very moral flaws like racism that she herself seems to have privately held. I mean, Everything That Rises Must Converge is one of the most brilliant critiques of white, liberal condescension and old Southern racism ever written.
And yet the person who wrote it held some of those same views.
It's a tension that just doesn't resolve. We want our artistic heroes to be morally pure, and Flannery O'Connor just wasn't. She was as flawed and contradictory as one of her own characters.
And so much what we know about her inner life comes from those letters. The main collection, The Habit of Being, edited by Sally Fitzgerald, is considered a literary work in its own right.
Oh, absolutely. Some people argue her letters are her greatest work. She corresponded with major poets like Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop, but for years, one of her most important correspondence was a complete mystery. In the book, she's just referred to as A.
Yeah, it sounds so mysterious.
It was for a long time. It turned out A was a woman named Betty Hester, a file clerk from Atlanta. She just wrote O'Connor a fan letter one day, a very intelligent one, and it sparked this incredibly deep, years-long correspondence about faith, literature, despair, everything.
And her identity was kept secret.
At her own request, Betty Hester gave the letters to Sally Fitzgerald for the book on the condition that she remain anonymous. Her identity was only finally revealed after her death when the full unsealed collection was opened at Emory University in 2007. It just goes to show how O'Connor could forge these profound intellectual and spiritual connections through writing because her physical world was so small.
Her letters were her lifeline.
They were, and what's amazing is that we're still discovering things about her. Here we are in the 2020s and new material is still surfacing.
Let's talk about some of that recent stuff. In 2024, a new O'Connor book was published, Why Do the Heathen Rage?
Which is just incredible to think about. This was her unfinished third novel, the book she was working on when she died. A scholar named Jessica Hooton Wilson took the fragments, the drafts, the notes, and assembled them into a coherent volume.
So it gives us a glimpse of where she was headed creatively?
It does. It draws on characters and themes from stories like The Enduring Chill and Why Do the Heathen Rage. It seems like she might have been trying to move in a slightly different direction, maybe away from the pure grotesque and towards something else, but we'll never really know for sure.
And then there's the art. We talked about her college cartoons, but in 2023, there was a major discovery in the attic of her childhood home in Savannah.
A treasure trove. They found 2 large barrels just filled with paintings she had done on wood tiles.
And they had been hidden.
They'd been hidden away for decades. The story is that the trustees of her estate were worried that if people knew she was also a painter, it might somehow, distract from her legacy as a serious writer.
That's a strange kind of logic.
It is, but now they've been recovered and they're slated to be exhibited in 2025. It just adds another whole layer to her creativity. She was always making things, whether with words or with a paintbrush.
And popular culture is still wrestling with her, too. There was the 2023 film Wildcat.
Right, directed by Ethan Hawke, starring his daughter Maya Hawke as Flannery. It focuses on her early years and her struggle to get Wise Blood published.
But we should probably add a little academic disclaimer here.
We should. A number of O'Connor scholars have taken issue with the film's historical accuracy. One scholar, Bruce Gentry, went so far as to claim it contains 500 factual errors.
500.
So it's probably best to view it as a fictionalized, impressionistic take on her life, not a documentary. It's a movie. It needs a movie's narrative arc, which doesn't always line up with the messy reality of a person's life.
That's good advice. So we have all these new discoveries, the art, the unfinished book, the film. But ultimately, her story ends where it began, in a way, with the disease that had shadowed her since she was a teenager.
It does. In the summer of 1964, she had to have surgery for a fibroid tumor. The stress of the surgery caused her lupus, which had been in a kind of remission, to flare up with a vengeance.
And she knew what was happening.
Oh, she knew. She wrote a letter to a friend, a nun named Sister Mariella Gable, and she used this absolutely chilling phrase. She said, "The wolf, I'm afraid, is inside tearing up the place."
The wolf is inside, and lupus, the word itself, is Latin for wolf.
She knew exactly what she was writing. It was the end. She died on August 3rd, 1964. She was only 39 years old.
39. It's just so young. But the body of work she left is so dense, so heavy. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's try to synthesize it. What's the big takeaway from Flannery O'Connor?
I think you have to see her as a writer who viewed the world as a spiritual battleground. Full stop. A constant war for the souls of humanity. And she used humor, this incredibly dark, biting humor, as her primary weapon, both to deal with her own physical pain and to expose the absolute absurdity of a modern world that was trying to live without God, without any sense of sin or need for redemption.
And that, I think, is the so what for us today. Why does she still matter so much? We live in a world that is so incredibly curated. Our social media lives are all about presenting a filtered, sentimental, pretty version of reality.
Exactly. And Flannery O'Connor is the ultimate antidote to that. She offers what you might call an unsentimental acceptance of imperfection. She demands that you, the reader, look at the grotesque reality of things, your own flaws, your own mortality, your own capacity for ugliness, and find grace there in the mess, not in some cleaned-up, filtered fantasy. It's a real corrective.
It makes me think of that little controversy over the postage stamp.
Oh, that is the perfect final example. In 2015, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp to honor her, and the portrait they used was nice.
He was too nice.
That's what the critics said. They argued it was a complete betrayal of who she was. It was this soft focus portrait of her with some pretty decorative peacock feathers in the background that made her look pleasant, like a kindly, gentle librarian who likes birds.
And pleasant is the last word anyone would use to describe Flannery O'Connor or her work.
Not even close. This was a woman who wore these sharp, aggressive cat-eye glasses, whose face was scarred and swollen from her medication. She wrote, in her own words, to shock a morally blind world. And by smoothing out her image on that stamp, by making her palatable and pretty, the USPS was doing exactly what she accused the Northern reader of doing.
They were trying to make the grotesque acceptable.
Trying to make it comfortable. And her entire project was about making us uncomfortable for the good of our own souls.
So the question she leaves us with is, are we willing to look at the world and at ourselves, as it actually is, backward-walking chickens, violent grace and all? Or do we just want the soft-focus postage stamp version?
It's a question I think she would be very pleased we're still asking.
Well, on that provocative thought, I think that's where we'll end our deep dive for today. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you.